You turn on your screens, you read the major newspapers this morning, and the elites in Washington are cheering. They tell you that a grand military campaign in the Middle East is proceeding exactly according to plan. They boast about destroyed bunkers and a new order being established by force. But let us strip away the lies of the mainstream media. Let us look straight at the naked truth that the ivory tower elites do not want you to see. What we are witnessing is not strategic glory. This is geopolitical suicide. This is the catastrophic collapse of a hubristic delusion, orchestrated by the exact same minds who have dragged us into deadly quagmires for the last 30 years. The Western leadership is completely drunk on its own firepower. The Israeli military sent a broad wave of strikes at the Iranian capital, and the elites are celebrating. The Pentagon beats its chest, boasting that U.S. forces have carried out 3,000 airstrikes against Iran since operations began. They are euphoric over the destruction of an underground bunker beneath the compound of Iran's slain supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who was killed in earlier strikes. And the absolute pinnacle of this hubris is clearly demonstrated when President Trump takes to social media to demand unconditional surrender from Iran. The White House press secretary even boldly declared that the U.S. would only consider Iran in a state of unconditional surrender when President Trump determines the country no longer poses a threat. Washington arrogantly believes it can dictate who will be the next supreme leader of a sovereign nation. Stop and analyze the mechanics of this extreme naivete. Washington believes they can use sheer military force to devastate a hardline autocracy from the outside and force a regime change, much like the failed Venezuela model they once tried to apply. But Iran is not a mindless pawn on the Pentagon's map. It is a nation operating on the harshest logic of survival in an anarchic system. When you directly threaten the core existence of a state, they do not surrender. They fight like a cornered animal because for their leadership, this is an existential war. Look at the bloody history we created. In 2003, the American elite marched into Iraq with the delusion that they would be greeted with roses and the war would end in 6 weeks, just as Donald Rumsfeld boasted. Instead, we threw Iraq into a sea of chaotic fire that dragged on for 8 years. Look at Libya. We crushed their state system and turned the nation into a giant slave market. This time, the level of material destruction is happening at a terrifying speed, upending most norms of warfare and its old timelines. But the tragic entropy remains exactly the same. But the tragedy does not stop at localized hubris. Western arrogance has activated the massive gears of global power politics, giving birth to a structure of resistance that we shaped with our own hands. They tell you Iran is isolated, but the truth is that Russia is directly intervening in the war by providing Iran with intelligence about the locations and movements of American troops, ships, and aircraft. Much of this lethal intelligence is beamed directly from Moscow's sophisticated constellation of overhead satellites. U.S. officials confirm that Russia is constantly updating information on U.S. military assets to help Iran target them. And Washington is surprised, completely naive. This is the fundamental mechanism of the anarchic balance of power. The enemy of my enemy must become a strategic ally. For decades, we have relentlessly expanded the NATO military alliance right up to Russia's doorstep, turning Eastern Europe into a powder keg. We unleashed the most crushing sanctions to drain their economy. The structural result is that we forced Moscow into a tight embrace with Beijing and Tehran. Russia and Iran have built a deep defense industrial alliance over the years, where Iran provides drones for the battlefield in Ukraine, and in return receives nuclear technology and invaluable intelligence from Russia. When the U.S. deploys over 50,000 troops, more than 200 fighter jets, and 2 aircraft carriers to strangle the Middle East, Russia sees a golden opportunity. By sharing targeting data, Moscow ensures the American war machine bleeds. The practical consequences hit home when an Iranian drone struck a makeshift facility housing U.S. troops in Kuwait, killing 6 U.S. service members. That is not a coincidence. That is the price of ignoring the laws of the balance of power. We are spending staggering amounts of money, reportedly $1 billion a day, funding this war of destruction while American youth risk their lives for the strategic blunders of policymakers. And this brings us to the most brutal aspect, stripping away all the hypocritical rhetoric of the so-called rules-based order that the West constantly preaches. They talk about human rights in luxurious, air-conditioned boardrooms. They talk about protecting democracy at international forums. Meanwhile, on the blood-soaked and smoke-filled ground, expert analysis suggests the United States military was likely responsible for a deadly strike on the Shajari Tayyiba Elementary School in southern Iran. The consequence of that action is that at least 168 children and 14 teachers were killed, crushed under tons of concrete. 168 kids. Why did this tragedy happen? Because that school was located adjacent to an Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps naval base. Military experts call it a massive targeting failure, a complete breakdown in the intelligence cycle where they failed to update the fact that the school had a fence erected to separate it from the military base. This is the true face of material warfare that the elites always try to hide. We furiously condemn our adversaries for violating international law, but when our precision-guided munitions explode in the middle of a school courtyard, taking the lives of hundreds of students, we casually refer to it as an ongoing investigation into civilian harm. This is the cruel double standard weaponized by the strong. Raw military power has no eyes and no heart. Flaming shrapnel does not distinguish between a military bunker and a classroom. The naked truth is that in any wide area bombing and attrition warfare, innocent civilians are always the sacrificial lambs. Look at Lebanon. Unconditional Western support has allowed Israel to intensify its bombing campaign, leveling civilian areas and forcing about 300,000 people to flee their homes. The United Nations has repeatedly sounded the alarm about a sprawling humanitarian crisis spiraling out of control, where homes, hospitals, and schools are being hit and destroyed. Yet the elites still blindly believe they can absorb all these losses. They forget a basic physical principle. True power does not just lie in the number of bombs dropped on an enemy's capital, but in the endurance of the economic foundation. The global economy is bleeding heavily. The market structure is fracturing. Brent crude, the international oil benchmark, settled at more than $92 a barrel, an increase of almost 30% over the past week. This brutal surge is the biggest since the nightmare of the coronavirus pandemic in April 2020. Crucial maritime corridors, especially the Strait of Hormuz, are on the verge of being completely choked off, directly threatening global energy and food supply chains. The situation is so desperate that a U.S. government agency had to immediately announce a massive $20 billion maritime insurance plan just to beg oil and gas tankers to keep moving through this high-risk region. The United States even had to consider unsanctioning Russian oil, granting India permission to purchase Russian crude stranded at sea to soothe the thirst for energy and prevent an explosion in prices. A supreme, bitter irony where we have to ask for favors from the very state we are trying to strangle. The stock market reacted with sheer panic, pushing the S&P 500 into negative territory for the year with its worst week so far. We are setting fire to our own financial foundations, depleting our munitions stockpiles to the point where the White House had to urgently summon giant defense contractors like Lockheed Martin and Boeing to beg them to build more weapons. Draining resources for a war that yields no core survival benefits is the exact definition of strategic suicide. Even if Iran's ability to launch missiles is degraded under the immense pressure of bombing, their capacity to wage asymmetrical warfare, to choke off vital arteries, is more than enough to drag the Western economy into the mud. Take a step back and look at the whole picture of this ruthless geopolitical chessboard. The only true peer competitor that actually threatens America's hegemonic position is standing on the sidelines, smiling. China is carefully taking notes on every lesson. U.S. intelligence suggests that Beijing may be preparing to provide Iran with financial assistance, spare parts, and missile components to keep this fire burning. Although China acts cautiously because it relies heavily on energy supplies, their core objective is crystal clear. They want the U.S. tied down, bogged down, and exhausted in the deserts of the Middle East, far away from the crucial theater of the Asia Pacific. Every expensive bomb dropped on Tehran, every $1 billion evaporated on the stock market, every artillery shell leaving U.S. reserves is a priceless strategic gift handed to Beijing. History will not judge us by our lofty rhetoric about freedom or democracy. History will record this era as a bloody indictment of the blindness of a great power that smashed its own foundation of power because it refused to understand the limits of material strength. We gamble human lives, we gamble economic stability, and we shatter the regional order just to chase after delusional fantasies of absolute submission. This massive war machine has been started, and its crushing inertia will drag us into structural consequences that cannot be reversed. Stay safe, stay awake, and never stop asking questions. The truth is out there. I will see you next time. Hello, my friends, and welcome back to a ruthless but necessary analysis